Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of The Witch. I do not have a whole lot of time to do this, so this video is probably going to be pretty damn short. So, I knew nothing about The Witch going in. I never even saw the trailer or read what the premise was about. I presumed it was about a witch, but the only thing I was aware of was the film's very positive reception amongst both professional critics and horror fans. So that got me excited because every year there's that one horror movie that stands out amongst the rest and terrifies the masses. Last year it was It Follows. The year before that was The Babadook. And while The Witch might be that movie for this year, I was left feeling underwhelmed. Now, to be fair, it's not really the movie's fault. Fear is subjective. A lot of people probably saw, It Follows and the Babadook movies, which I really liked, if not loved, and probably felt the same way, that it let them down. It never quite stimulated them on that level. Because I do think The Witch is a good movie. I just wasn't blown away by it, and I kind of feel like there's a certain amount of truth to what I'm saying, because I feel like I could actually break down and explain why the film didn't quite work for me, at least on the level that it wanted to. But before I get into that, let me start with what I actually did like about the movie. For one, it actually had a pretty good script. I thought the characters had distinct personalities. I liked how they had different weaknesses and how those weaknesses were used against them in a surprisingly understated way for a movie like this. I thought their character arcs were compelling. I liked, even though they were often used to kind of deconstruct religion and show, how it can go wrong, they were all very nuanced. They were human, and even when they were doing something bad, saying something cruel, making the wrong decision, I felt like I understood where they were coming from, even if, I completely disagreed with them. And that's, I thought, pretty good character writing. I thought the ending was a little. I'm still debating with myself as to whether it was in character for somebody to do a certain thing or make a certain decision. You could argue that it was properly foreshadowed. You could argue that it wasn't. I'm still not entirely sure. That's one of those things where I need to watch this movie again before I make my final decision. I liked how it, even though, yeah, you could interpret this as a scathing criticism against religion, most of their flaws were independent of their faith. So, it's one of those things that people will probably argue about for quite some time. But I thought it was handled pretty well. I didn't find this movie to be, offensive towards Christianity or anything. But of course, it doesn't portray it in a flattering light either. To me, it's more nihilistic than anything else. It just, God remains silent, and sometimes faith isn't enough. But it just comes down to your own interpretation of that. Um, I thought it was very well directed in terms of its visual style. I liked the dread-soaked atmosphere. This is a very bleak and grim looking movie. There's a lot of gray, a lot of dark coloring. The lighting is very shadowy, often murky, but in a way I thought worked. I felt like I saw everything I needed to see, and when the lighting was darker, and this film does become progressively more dimly lit as it goes along, as the content darkens. I felt like I always saw enough, but at the same time, it really did add to the atmosphere. So, the cinematography was definitely great. There's some haunting imagery. I loved the exterior shots of the woods. They just look very sinister without being overtly so. The interior shots, it seemed like they used a lot more close-ups, and it really gave me this claustrophobic feeling, and that's what it was obviously going for. It wanted to put you in these characters' shoes, and this is a very cramped dwelling, and so that it worked well in that area as well. Uh, I thought the director did a really good job at building tension. He handled the suspense incredibly well. There were a lot of times I was totally, on the edge of my seat, chewing my nails, eyes wide. Even though, yeah, the film is slow, it's just doing a slow burn style of suspense. I was never bored. I was always invested. However, where I think he fumbled was, even though he built up to the scares very well, the scares themselves were very limp. I'm not saying that this movie needed jump scares. Don't interpret my words like that. But I always felt like every time it started to get really terrifying, the movie would abruptly cut away into something else. And that totally just deflated that tension every time it did that. And I swear to God, every single scary scene in this movie had that problem. There's this one bit where this kid's lost in the woods and the music's getting all ominous and creepy, and the score is also great, by the way. But I was totally into it. It was terrifying. And then it just cuts away to something else. And I was like, oh. And every time it did that, it just took away from the movie, in my opinion. And it never had a great moment of release, that catharsis where, the nervousness, the whimper becomes a shriek. I was thinking to myself that, if the ending is awesome, I could probably forgive all of this. And unfortunately, the ending didn't make up for it at all. The ending's divided pretty much everybody. Some think it's a perfect conclusion to the story. The others think that it didn't fit at all and was rather weak. I'm in the middle. I didn't think it was a bad way to conclude the story, but it didn't haunt me in any way. It didn't freak me out. And that's, I think, the big difference between this and something like It Follows. It Follows really worked its magic on me. That movie stayed with me on the way home and kept me continuously creeped out throughout the rest of the night. This one didn't. I was never really that scared, even though, yeah, it wasn't a total failure in that regard. Like I said, it built up the suspense very well, but it gave no payoff. And so by the time I got home, I was just kind of like, I was a little more annoyed for a reason I'm going to talk about in a second. But, there are certainly some horrific implications. This film has balls, there's no denying. Kids are in peril. And I really got to respect it for going into territory you usually do not see movies go into. But the fact that he just needed to hold those scary scenes just a bit longer for them to reach their full potential. And they needed to end on a more climactic note. So, the one thing, though, that the more I think about it, pisses me off, even though I also respect the movie for it, is the language barrier. Characters in this movie speak English. The problem is they speak older dialect of English with very thick accents. So they're like, the easier things to understand are when they say something like thee and thou, but really it gets a lot more detailed when it comes to how it presents the language. And it's trying to be authentic. And a lot of people are going to love this. And I gotta give them a lot of respect. It seems like they put a lot of time and effort into making sure if it wasn't correct, if it wasn't authentic, then at least it had the illusion of being authentic. And yeah, the costumes, same thing. The costume sets, they all felt like they belonged in the 16th century or the 17th century, whatever. But the problem is, I could not understand a single thing of what they were talking about. So it was weird. Like, I'd get the words, I'd understand the words, but it just would never quite click with me. I'm over-exaggerating to a point. Yeah, there were times when I obviously could tell what they meant. You know, when they say something like, "Do you want to live deliciously?" I could figure that out, but it seemed like I was spending too much time trying to decipher what they were saying, and that probably took away from everything else. So for me, instead of being immersive, it was more distracting. Not everybody's going to agree with me there. That's just my own opinion, and I just thought it was unnecessary, and it's going to alienate a lot of people. So I can't, in good conscience, say The Witch is a masterpiece. I do plan on watching it again when it comes out on DVD. I'm going to turn on those subtitles, and maybe I'll get a lot more out of it. But for my first viewing experience, I thought this was a good movie. I just did not think it was great. I think it was overhyped, and the flaws did really frustrate me, even though the strengths also really impressed me. So I do think it's worth watching, particularly if you're a horror fan, but you have to expect that this isn't going to be about jump scares. It's not going to be the fastest paced a movie, even though it is relatively short, so the slow pacing never really wore me down. And the language barrier might just outright frustrate you, if not piss you off. But it is good enough in the right areas that I do think it's worth watching. If not in theaters, then at least on the small screen. So I did do a written review. Please read that. Also follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and I should have my review of WWE's Fastlane up soon. So stay tuned for that, and I shall see you guys later.